What's going on, everyone? I'm just a typical average American here today to react and learn about the Canadian Rangers. Now, I don't claim to know much about the Canadian military or much about anything for that matter, but I heard this name, the Canadian Rangers, as some kind of part of the Canadian military, to my understanding, and just the name alone kind of got my interest in the fact that I had never heard that name before. I have heard of the Mounties. All Americans know about Mounties. I actually reacted to how Mounties are trained and what their purpose are, and that blew my mind where it was like, okay, me and most Americans thought Mounties were all over the place in Canada, keeping the law in towns and cities, wearing their red uniforms, and nah, it's not like that at all, is what I found out, which is great. I love learning about things that completely turn around my whole idea or predisposition in my mind of what I thought it was. So I'm really interested to learn about today another part of the Canadian military, the Canadian Rangers. Now, I know about the American military. We have branches, we got the Navy and the Army and the Marines and the Air Force and the Coast Guard, even a Space Force, and tons of other little divisions other than those in our military. And I imagine Canada is somewhat similar with lots of different divisions or departments or groups or forces. And I think the Canadian Rangers is one of them. So I'm going to learn a little bit here from old Wikipedia about the Canadian Rangers' history and what their function is. And then I have a little video with some of the Canadian Rangers actually explaining who they are and what they do and what they stand for, which sounds very, very nice as well. So, the Canadian Rangers are a subcomponent of the Canadian Army under the Canadian Armed Forces, reserves that provide a limited military presence in regions of Canada where stationing conventional army units would be practical or not economically valuable. The Canadian Rangers are stationed where regular army could not be practically stationed. What does that mean? Formally established in 1947, the Canadian Rangers employs around 5,000 Rangers. Pretty small unit, like pretty select group, only 5,000 Canadian Rangers total. I just want to know where they're being sent to, where it's not practical to send regular Canadian Army. Are they going into the Canadian volcanoes? Like, how specialized is this group exactly? Oh, we got the badge or emblem here, Canadian Rangers, I'm looking at on the right. Oh, it's got leaves, of course, and a gun and an axe. That is kind of awesome. That is kind of an awesome badge, seriously, and it's very Canadian. Wow. The Canadian Rangers are responsible for remote, isolated, sparsely populated regions of Canada, such as northern Canada and the coastlines. Oh! Northern Canada, like where it's very cold? Yeah, northern Canada, where it's not densely populated. Canadian Rangers are responsible for remote, isolated, sparsely populated regions. Okay. That's interesting, dedicating an entire group of the military to those areas. But I could see where that actually makes a lot of sense, because those areas kind of need their own dedicated force, because you're not going to have a lot of military personnel out, especially in northern Canada where it's like gigantic and desolate and very isolated and cold. So, okay, I'm starting to get an idea of what this is all for. They regularly conduct surveillance, patrols, inspections of the North Warning System? What is the North Warning System? The North Warning System is a joint US and Canadian early warning radar system for atmospheric defense. Oh, thank you, Canadian Rangers. Apparently you are helping protect yourself, Canada, and the United States by manning the atmospheric air defense, the North Warning System. My goodness, thank you. Okay, that makes me feel safer at night, knowing the Canadian Rangers got my back. They also act as guides, scouts, and subject matter experts in such disciplines as wilderness survival. Right, that feels like it's a big component of the Canadian Rangers. like wilderness, survival, cold, very extreme climate to be dedicated to. So this is fascinating. This is a very specialized group. 5,000 total. What else do we have here? The Canadian Rangers are a unit of the Canadian Armed Forces made up of Inuit, First Nations, Métis, and other Canadians. They are made up of Native Canadian groups, if I'm understanding. Inuit, First Nations, like, yeah, the groups of Native Canadians that are living throughout Canada. Do they particularly live in northern Canada? Is that correct? That's awesome. That makes so much sense too, because that's where they'd be located, and so they would be a part of this Canadian Armed Force. And they'd probably already have like a culture or history of being quite good and skilled and practical in those types of climates and areas, because they probably lived there as a culture for like a long, long time. Wow, this is very interesting. There's a misconception that the Canadian Rangers is a First Nations unit. Many Rangers are not. Okay, so there's a lot of First Nations Canadians in this unit, but it's not mandatory or anything. Wow, Canadian Rangers provide a limited military presence in Canada's remote areas, receive 12 days of formal training, considered to be somewhat always on duty. Okay. Oh, observing and reporting as part of their daily lives? So, oh, that's interesting. Being a Canadian Ranger is like a lifestyle. It's not your job. It kind of is, but it's not your day job. It's just you're observing and reporting to the Canadian military as a Canadian Ranger, just as a lifestyle. Like you're stationed somewhere in Canada, probably in the north or on the coast, or whatever they said were the areas. And it's, I don't know how to say it. It's like, I don't know if it's volunteer work or if you get some kind of compensation, but you're basically fulfilling your service to Canada in these really isolated, cold regions. That's awesome. Big respect to Canadian Rangers. Canadian Rangers are paid when formally on duty. Oh, there you go. Okay, good. They're paid according to the rank they hold. Okay, they're paid. The 5,000 Rangers are split between 5 Canadian patrolled groups. Okay, that's a little too much detail for right now. What do we have here? Equipment. That's interesting. Each Canadian Ranger is issued a red Canadian Ranger sweatshirt. Oh, look at that. Here we go. Oh, yeah, they are. Sweatshirt with the badge, the Canadian Ranger badge on it, camouflaged pants, combat boots, baseball cap, safety vest, rifle. Yeah, they are expected to be mostly self-reliant regarding equipment. This is a very much like a take care of yourself and report back and for duty type of assignment, isn't it? They're really given a lot of autonomy and self-responsibility. They're provided some amount of equipment, weapons. Since 1947, the Canadian Rangers has been issued a British Lee Enfield No. 14 rifle. This thing looks a bit old, no offense. Is this really? No, this still to this day? Is there? Oh, rifle replacement. Thank goodness. No offense to the rifle. I mean, it's cool, but that doesn't seem necessary to have to go out with that thing in 2023. The replacement of the Lee Enfield rifle had been expected, and in 2021, the Canadian Forces issued the Bolt Action Rifle. What is it? It's a Tikka T3 Compact Tactical Rifle. Man, I'm letting the American in me take control too much. Oh, what kind of gun do they have? What kind of rifle do they have exactly? Oh, can't they get a better one? Oh, I'm letting the American in me get a little carried away there. Okay. Chain of command. Canadian Rangers became part of the Canadian Army in 2007. That's not very long ago. Like, what? Like 15, 16 years ago? Having previously been under the Vice Chief of Defense. No. Wait a minute. At the beginning, they're established in 1947. They just technically became under the chain of command of the Canadian Army in 2007. Okay, just to clarify that. Okay, patrol areas. There's 5 patrol areas. Oh, Northwest Territories, Yukon, Nunavut. Yeah, really, the really North Territories. Quebec, Ontario as well. Manitoba, wait, they're like everywhere, but probably in the northern parts as well. Okay, very nice. Okay, that gives me a much better idea of what the Canadian Rangers function is, a little about when they started, even what they're packing out there in terms of guns and equipment. So I have this little video here featuring Whitney Lochinbauer, Honorary Lieutenant Colonel, 1st Canadian Ranger Patrol Group, who's going to talk about the history of the Canadian Rangers and what it's all about. So I'm excited for this.
The Canadian Rangers really were born of the emerging idea of a Cold War in 1946 and 1947, and the dilemma of how Canada was going to defend such a great big country with such a sparse northern population.
Exactly. Now I'm really getting it now. The Canadian Rangers, born out of this idea of like, what about northern Canada, where there's very few people comparatively and a lot of land?
So one of the solutions was, what about going and turning to people who actually live in those areas themselves?
Yeah.
Giving them a light amount of equipment, only a rifle and a couple hundred rounds of ammunition.
Right.
The uniform consisted of an armband. Give them very modest training and basically ask these people to serve as eyes and ears for the Canadian military.
Yeah, it's almost like militia, like regular people coming up and like serving your nation as soldiers when the time calls for it. But this is more than militia, like quite a bit more. These are basically people living in northern Canada who have decided to devote themselves to serving the country and being a protector and eyes and ears of where they live. So there's kind of an incentive for them as well, and obviously something to be proud of.
In their regions. When they saw something strange, like a submarine, or when they saw strange vessels or strange aircraft, to go to whoever they could with a radio to be able to communicate back down south what they'd seen.
Yeah, this makes so much sense. It's so useful for everyone, because otherwise it'd be impossible for Canada to know what's going on in all parts of Canada, because Canada is so big. So this is very smart.
At other times, they undertook search and rescue and also played a key role in guiding and assisting Southern forces that came north to their homeland to go and actually operate.
Wow.
So the Rangers slowly took shape in the 1940s and early 1950s, growing out not only into the territorial north, but also down the Pacific coast, and also out into what became Newfoundland and Labrador. And it grew.
Oh, there's actually like Rangers like decently spread out through Canada, actually.
Modestly to about 2,700 people by 1957. And then the Canadian military took a different approach to defending its remote areas. Things changed with the onset of the Soviet bomber threat and the creation of dramatic radar lines, particularly distant early warning lines spanning the Canadian Arctic, which seemed to render obsolete both the threat of a land force invasion and the need for people on the ground to be looking to the skies.
So literally Canada built gigantic, enormous satellites and like radio, or what do they call them? They call them radar lines? Yeah. So these giant things are doing a lot of the groundwork instead. So what? They were like, oh, maybe the Rangers aren't necessary anymore because we have this?
So a lot of the attention shifted away from the Rangers who were there on the ground. They continued a very quiet existence during the 1960s, so that by the end of that decade, the Rangers really didn't have as clear of a role anymore.
Well, I mean, I imagine there's always going to be a very valuable reason to have human beings, like in the Canadian military, serving like in these remote areas, not just like robots scanning everything.
By the early 1970s, the military faced the dilemma of whether to actually shut down and disband the Rangers or recreate it in a different form. And they chose the latter option. So the Rangers were re-stood up. In the north, it was very much decided by sovereignty issues now, following the test run of an American supertanker to see whether or not the Northwest Passage, Canada's waters, would actually be used as a transit route to carry American oil down to the eastern seaboard from Alaska. So there was
I always raise my I always raise my eyebrows when America is mentioned in one of these. I'm like, what did we do? What did we do something wrong?
One part of the ranger organization focused on the territories. At the same time, a second organization of rangers focused on the Atlantic, particularly Newfoundland, Labrador, and the northern shore of Quebec, to continue to be coast watchers.
Right.
So these two organizations persisted up until the late 1980s. At this moment, there was a tremendous focus on what the Rangers could offer in the Arctic, which propelled a tremendous period of growth in the 1980s and 90s.
Nice.
So that Bob...
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I'm seeing like a really real important purpose for the Canadian Rangers. So I'm glad, seemingly of their own accord, to their desire to want to be valuable assets to Canada, like really kept up like a very important purpose in serving as the eyes and ears and people, human beings on the ground in these remote parts of Canada. So I like that a lot.
By 1998, when the Canadian Ranger Patrol Groups were stood up, representing 5 distinct regions of Canada, we truly once again had a coast-to-coast-to-coast organization.
Yeah. Oh, here we go. This is what I want to see. The Rangers on snowmobiles. Like, this is the stuff I imagine.
Their tasks had changed to get rid of a combat focus, so very much a focus on support to domestic operations and support to sovereignty operations.
Right, so they were created around wartime and combat, and that had to evolve to now more of like a surveillance and data and upkeep kind of mission, which is also extremely important.
But at the same time, a continued presence at a local level, serving local needs, be it addressing avalanches or forest fires, humanitarian emergencies. So this wonderful balance has been maintained over time between national military interests, being able to support Southern troops that come into the regions, and at the same time being able to address local needs.
Right. That's a great way of putting it. To me, this has always seemed like a great support for the local communities, and having like that connection between these remote local communities and the Canada and the Canadian government and Canadian military, like that seems like such an important thread to keep intact.
A balance that I think has persisted very strongly over 70 years and has now, I think, come to be very much respected and appreciated for what it offers.
Nice.
I often say to Rangers at the end of a training exercise or when I've interacted with them that at the end, they genuinely make me prouder to be Canadian.
Yeah. I like their hoodies as well. Wow, what is this? Canadian Army. Strong, proud, ready. Oh, that's the tagline. I actually didn't know that. Okay, very interesting stuff. Very good stuff. I mean, again, I went into this with a name, Canadian Rangers. I was like, what is that? And it's a lot, and it's important. And it's honestly like a lot of Canadian pride going on here. I can feel it. Again, this was by the Canadian Army channel, actually. And I gotta give that a like, because I liked that quite a bit. What a fascinating, very, like, interesting story of a Canadian military force. I don't know much of anything about the Canadian military. So this was actually very fun to learn about. I don't know if there's any kind of equivalent to this in the United States military that I can think of. Probably nothing quite like this. So the Canadian Rangers are honestly something quite special and meaningful. Interesting with the story of them, how they kind of lost their purpose for a bit with technology coming in, and now in the modern day, they represent something different but important to Canada as a whole, and it's just nice. It's fun to learn about this. Anyway, if you enjoyed this as well, feel free to give this video a like or leave a comment. And if you're interested in more videos like this, me reacting to Canada and Canadian culture and stuff about Canada I've never learned before, feel free to subscribe for more. And until then, thanks for watching, and see you next time.